Every villain in Zelda was once somebody's abandoned kid. The Happy Mask salesman lost something he still won't name, Majora was a toy before it was a god, and Zant needed a whole race's rejection before he ever touched a helmet. Something in Hyrule keeps building monsters out of ordinary grief. That's why today I'm breaking down the 8 most disturbing backstories in Zelda and what they actually mean, starting with the man who was crowned before he ever got to choose anything for himself. Ganondorf. In Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf became king the moment he was born, a detail the game never draws attention to. The crown landed on him the day he was born. That's the loneliest fact in the franchise. Every 100 years, the Gerudo tribe produces exactly one son. That child becomes king by default, before he's old enough to hold a spoon, let alone a kingdom. Ganondorf inherited a crown the way most people inherit eye color. The surface story paints him as a schemer. He worms his way into Hyrule Castle, wins the royal family's trust with patience and charm, then guts them for the Triforce of Power the moment their backs are turned. That's the version the history books in Hyrule would write. Cunning, patient, evil to the bone. But look at what the games actually hand him alongside the betrayal. In The Wind Waker, his homeland is a vast desert where the wind carried nothing but death, as he describes it. 100 years of expectation can be read as sitting on one man's shoulders from the moment of his birth, waiting for him to fix a problem he had no obvious tools to solve. Read this way. Ambition looks a lot different when the alternative is watching your people wither, then the series pulls the rug out entirely. Ganondorf is repeatedly framed as the vessel for Demise's hatred, a curse older than Hyrule itself, and the games never ask whether the body it chose had any say in the matter. Under that reading, his rage predates his own choices by literal centuries. Strip away the mythology, and you're left with a kid handed a title, a homeland defined by a death-bearing wind and somebody else's fury, all before he had a say in any of it. Read this way, Fate and Class did the actual work. Demise's curse just gave it a name and a throne. A curse you inherit at least comes with a face and a name. What comes next hands out. Cursed things for a living, wears a permanent grin while he does it, and the games have never explained what he actually is. The Happy Mask Salesman. The scariest man in Termina has never thrown a punch. He grabs you by the shoulders, leans in way too close, and asks about your masks with a grin that does not move, even when his voice drops into something cold. That is the whole threat. Proximity and a smile that stays fixed while the mood in the room curdles around it, and somehow that is worse than half the bosses in this franchise. His actual job description is simple enough. He sends Link after Majora's Mask before it drops the moon on an entire population, which makes him, on paper, the guy trying to save everyone. But look at how he actually operates. He works out of the clock tower, no shop, no counter, and the masks Link collects come from side quests. Favors done for strangers, not items purchased off a shelf. The game repeatedly shows those masks holding memory, grief, and personality inside them, like a jar holding smoke. He tracks every one of them anyway. A broker for objects that carry pieces of dead or broken people, and he discusses them like he is bored. That arrangement gets extremely uncomfortable once you remember what Majora's Mask actually did to the child wearing it, a kid whose friends, the 4 giants, had left Termina, and the common reading is that he let the cursed object fill that absence with something monstrous just to feel noticed. The salesman spends the entire game one hand away from that same artifact, tracking it, discussing it, wanting it back, and never once flinching at what it is capable of. Familiarity does that to a person, or to whatever he is, because the games give him almost no backstory. No hometown, no species confirmation, no explanation for how a supposedly ordinary man ends up this fluent in world-ending curses. That gap is exactly why the fandom largely falls into 3 broad readings. Some read him as a guardian keeping catastrophic objects out of worse hands. Some read him as something ancient wearing a friendly face, closer kin to the curse than to the town he sells in. Nothing in the text rules either one out, and that is precisely the point of the 3rd reading. The one that finds him scariest simply for being a smiling shopkeeper who never once acts surprised by the apocalypse in his inventory. At least he is alive to smile. The next entry is about 2 men who served the crown with something beautiful and got death and a haunting for their trouble. The Composer Brothers. 2 musicians who served the royal family are already dead the first time you meet them, and Ocarina of Time never bothers to tell you when that happened. Flat and Sharp served the Hyrule court as composers, the kind of job that sounds cozy until you notice where the game actually introduces them. The Kakariko Village Graveyard, dressed as ghosts, still lingering at their posts as if the duty never ended. Years later in Termina's Ikana Canyon, Sharp turns up as the more corrupted of the 2 brothers, tangled in a much darker version of the same story. Flat's ending gets tied to the same rot, the same court, the same silence. Neither brother gets a scene explaining the moment it went wrong. You just show up decades late and meet the aftermath. That's the disturbing part. Court music is supposed to be the safest job in the castle, robes, applause, maybe a bad joke at the coronation. Instead, these two get remembered as a haunting, a version of loyalty that seems to have outlived their bodies. It plays like palace unfinished business. Somewhere in that castle, faithful service reads like an assignment nobody remembered to end. The brothers fit a reading that emerges from scattered details rather than any single stated fact. That music in Zelda keeps showing up as something sacred and something dangerous at the exact same time. Nothing in the games states that outright as a rule, but the pattern holds up. Songs open doors, stop time, summon storms, and apparently keep two dead composers on the clock long after retirement should have kicked in. It is hard not to wonder what else that crown looked past, while two of its own musicians rotted into ghosts nobody replaced. A haunting, at least, needs a person to haunt. The next thing has no body of its own, so it borrows yours, and it can pull the moon out of the sky in 3 days. Majora. Majora shows no interest in a kingdom. Whatever it wants, it isn't revenge, or land, or a crown, and that's exactly what makes it the most dangerous thing in Termina. Most of the threats on this list wanted something specific enough to bargain with. This one seems to want nothing but destruction, and it prefers a body to work through. The game hands you the stakes in the opening minutes: 3 days, 1 moon, 1 falling face with a grin carved into it. Fail the countdown and Termina gets flattened. Total impact. Nothing left standing. That clock is the whole horror engine. It turns every choice Link makes into triage. Majora doesn't rule Termina the way a tyrant would. It infects it. Skull Kid puts the mask on out of loneliness. The same hollow ache that's been the real monster maker this whole video, and Majora answers by turning him into a puppet with teeth. From there, the corruption spreads outward in layers. A curse on the swamp, a mountain frozen solid, a bay poisoned, a canyon haunted, each region getting its own localized apocalypse, almost as if it's feeding on whatever grief was already sitting there waiting. Beyond one vague legend, the mask's origin stays a blank. One story inside Termina calls it an item used by an ancient tribe in hexing rituals, and leaves it there. That blank space is the whole argument. Canon never confirms what Majora actually is, but the pattern makes a strong case for a reading. It prefers a wearer but can act on its own when pushed, and its only confirmed wearer was already grieving, already isolated, already primed to be filled with something. Follow that thread, and Majora starts to look like a parasite of personality, something built to convert loneliness and resentment into catastrophe. Feed it a lonely imp and you get a plague on 4 regions. Feed it a person who was already promised power and had it stripped away, and the apocalypse gets a face and a title. Same recipe, worse ingredients. A parasite looks for a host worth taking, and the perfect host is a man who was already told he was owed a throne and then denied it, hollowed out and just waiting for something to fill the empty space back up. Zant sits on a throne that arrived as a gift, wrapped and delivered by a stranger, and he thanks the stranger for it, like a dog rewarded with a scrap of meat. That's the detail that separates him from most warlords across Hyrule's history. He climbs to power without a single battle of his own, without a claim anybody recognized, without a coronation that meant anything until someone from an entirely different legend decided to use him. The surface story labels Zant a tyrant, a usurper king who buries the Twilight Realm in shadow and turns Midna into a fugitive in her own kingdom. That label is accurate as far as it goes. It just skips the transaction sitting underneath it. The Twilight Realm's throne passed him by, through bloodline and succession alike. Zant watched it go to someone else, stood outside that decision for years, and then Ganondorf arrived from a different legend entirely, and simply handed him the thing he'd been denied. Watch what that gift does to his body. His movements jerk and snap like a puppet running on too much slack in the strings. His voice cracks between a hush and a shriek in the same sentence, 2 registers fighting over one throat. A close watch of his combat choreography suggests something less like a warrior and more like a body wearing one, twitching whenever the wearer loses the thread. Nothing in the script spells out what's happening inside him, but the staging leaves one reading standing. A man who wanted to be chosen so badly that once something finally chose him, he lost the ability to separate his own will from the hand steering it. The receipts are posture, pitch, and pacing rather than a monologue, and scene after scene backs the same reading. That explains why he never settles. He isn't chasing a goal so much as chasing the feeling of finally mattering, a feeling that needs bigger proof every time it starts to fade. the same hunger for recognition that already turned one lonely child into an apocalypse. A recurring fan complaint holds that Zant peaks too early, that the calculating menace of his first appearance dissolves into flailing tantrums by the Hall of Mirrors. But that flailing plays as confirmation, not collapse. The character finishes the sentence his introduction started. Strip away the borrowed power, and what's left standing is too thin to hold a throne on its own. Zant was at least old enough to understand the bargain he was making. The next one had already been left behind by the only guardians he trusted, and hollowing him out took nothing more than the offer of company. The Skull Kid. A 3-day countdown to the end of the world starts because one kid wanted a friend to stick around. That is the actual scale of the trigger. Termina's moon does not fall because of ancient hatred or a grand design. It falls because a lonely imp put on a cursed mask and finally had the power to make people pay attention to him. Before Link ever chases him into that clock tower, Skull Kid already has a life. He runs with 2 fairies, Tattle and Tail, and he is bound in some way to the 4 giants who watch over Termina's regions. Then the giants leave to do their duty, and Skull Kid gets left behind. No goodbye tour, no explanation, just an empty forest where his friends used to be. That abandonment is the whole engine. Everything that happens after runs on it. Majora's Mask finds him in that state, grief-stricken and furious and starving for company, and it does what these masks do. It does not build a new personality. It grabs the resentment already sitting in his chest and turns the dial to apocalyptic. The pranks he might have pulled anyway, stealing an ocarina, scaring off a few villagers, curdle into stealing the moon itself and aiming it at the ground. Every region of Termina ends up paying for one kid's loneliness. The Deku Village, the mountains, the bay, the desert canyon, all of it sits under the same 3-day sentence because nobody came back for him. Compare that to Zant, screaming about a throne he was owed, marching an army to prove a point. Skull Kid has no army, no ideology, no grievance he could even put into words. He just has an absence where his friends used to stand, and it turns out that absence alone is enough to end a world. The machine doesn't need ambition. It runs fine on nothing but a hole where company used to be. Players have spent years arguing about what to call him for exactly this reason. Under the mask, he is genuinely terrifying, cackling, vindictive, gleeful about the countdown he's created. Take the mask off him at the right moment, though, and you get a kid who just seems tired and sad, confused about how things got this far. The game gives you both versions and never picks one for you. Some fans call him the series' most heartbreaking villain, a child hollowed out by loss long before he ever became dangerous. Others just see a victim who got handed a weapon he never should have touched. Both readings hold up, because the story earns both. What wanted to end the world only ever wanted a playmate. Loneliness at least means somebody once wanted him around. The next figure was built to serve, polished, charming, and completely hollow, with devotion standing exactly where a self should be. Girahim. Girahim bows before he tries to kill you, and that bow is the whole threat, dressed up in better posture than any villain has a right to. He introduces himself with a flourish, admires his own nails mid-conversation, and talks about carving you up the way most people talk about ordering dinner. He wants an audience for the violence, and he treats you like you should feel lucky to provide it. The theater is the point. That charm is doing a specific job. Underneath the ruffles and the wordplay, he is the self-styled demon lord and chief servant of demise, and his entire purpose in Skyward Sword is to hunt down Zelda so his master can be resurrected. He is actively driving the plot's darkest outcome forward, one polite, horrifying conversation at a time. In narrative terms, every bow and every cruel flourish serves that resurrection, a performance with a body count attached to the finale. The game gives you a cleaner way to see what he actually is by putting him next to Fi. Fi is loyal, precise, and entirely defined by service to her chosen hero, a spirit with no ambitions of her own outside that bond. Girahim reads as her mirror, arguably the same devotion, the same absence of personal agenda, pointed at the opposite master. Fi's servitude reads as quiet and selfless, his reads as gleeful and violent. Structurally, they run as the same design in 2 directions, one polished into a guiding voice, the other sharpened into a blade with a sense of humor. That mirroring is the strongest clue to who he actually is underneath the performance, and it points somewhere colder than flamboyant villain. The game never states his origin outright, so this part is a reading of the pattern rather than a confirmed history. Follow it anyway. A being defined entirely by service to another entity, with every gesture, every threat, every flicker of personality borrowed from the purpose he exists to fulfill, reads as a servant with no self outside his master's will. That is the same wound the video opened with, a lonely child hollowed out and refilled with something hungry. The process looks finished here. There is no boy underneath the theater waiting to feel abandoned, only the architecture of one, dressed up and still walking around. The theater is what remains, the entire visible structure built on top of an absence nobody bothered to fill with anything but purpose. He is loyal to demise, the way a weapon is loyal to a hand. It never chose the grip. Its memory starts at the moment it was picked up, and its story ends the instant that hand decides to set it back down. Every figure so far had a face you could read and a grievance you could name out loud. Girahim wanted an audience, and even that was borrowed, a performance built for someone else's war. The next one has neither face nor grievance, and that absence is exactly why it exposes the pattern most clearly. A whole people trapped inside their own homeland turning against them, with one enormous hunger taking shape in the dark at the center of it, waiting for something to walk close enough to feed. King Dodongo. The last monster in this video shows up with a cave full of starving people and a body big enough to block the exit. That's the entire introduction he gets. A silent wall of muscle standing between a species and its own food supply. That absence is the point. Every figure so far came with a face you could argue with, a grievance you could almost respect. King Dodongo arrives as pure consequence, a mouth and a body and nothing else, and the horror sits in what surrounds him rather than anything he says. Dodongo's cavern is Goron territory, the ancestral heart of a mining species whose entire culture runs on food they can no longer reliably get. By the time Link crawls through those tunnels, the Gorons are rationing and cornered, their elder sealed inside his chamber, waiting on help that never arrives fast enough. The cavern itself has gone volcanic and unstable, riddled with explosive lizards and bottomless heat, a homeland that used to sustain a species now actively trying to kill it. King Dodongo doesn't cause that collapse. He's what the collapse produces once it's had enough time to fester. Fan discussion has read him as exactly that. A body, ecological pressure built out of scarcity and neglect, not a monster who simply wandered into a mine. Canon never spells this out in a cutscene or a line of text. There's no Goron elder turning to camera to explain the metaphor. But follow the environmental detail and the pattern holds anyway. A starving population, a poisoned homeland, and a creature that only makes sense as the thing that crisis eventually births. That's a labeled leap, and it's worth naming as one. But look at what it lines up next to. Ganondorf swore loyalty to a king and cashed it in as betrayal. The exile came after, self-inflicted by his own ambition. The salesman peddled masks to a kingdom that had already let its people fall through the cracks. The Composer brothers lie buried in a graveyard built by the same hands that abandoned them. Majora ran on a child's loneliness, weaponized into an apocalypse. Zant needed someone to finally see him. Skull Kid just wanted his friends to come back. Girahim served a hatred so total it survived being cut into a sword. Every single one of them had a wound first and a weapon second. King Dodongo skips straight to the weapon. He carries a body and an appetite, full stop, the entire resume. A species pushed past its breaking point produced something huge and hungry, because that's what starvation does when it runs long enough and nobody intervenes. Strip the crown off Ganondorf, peel the porcelain off the salesman, take the divinity out of Majora, and what's left in every case is this same shape, a homeland in crisis, manufacturing, a body built to survive that crisis by consuming whatever's near it. Think about what that means for the 8 of them stacked together. A king, a merchant, 2 brothers, a moon, an usurper, a lost kid, a blade demon, and a lizard the size of a house, all running the exact same blueprint under different costumes. Hyrule has been building monsters out of its own neglect for the length of this entire video, and the machine doesn't care whether the final product gets a tragic monologue or just a hallway to guard. Sometimes the machine dresses its output up in armor and gives it a throne. Sometimes it just needs a cave, an empty larder, and enough time, and whatever crawls out gets a name players remember for decades and a backstory that fits in one sentence. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.